This is the final presentation for PUBHHMP 6630 for Group 5, consisting of Kara Blitz, Morgan Dillon, Caitlin Howell, Clara Kalis, and Bethany Yates. The title of our project is Community Health Workers to Address Chronic Absenteeism in Schools.
Chronic absenteeism is defined as a student missing 10% or 18 days of school, which is about 2.5 weeks out of the school year, including excused and unexcused absences. This has emerged as a pressing issue in Ohio, significantly affecting students' learning and long-term outcomes. It's closely linked with lower academic achievement, grade retention, and increased dropout rates, particularly among students facing poverty, health challenges, and family instability. In Ohio, chronic absenteeism sparked to 30.2% in the 2021 to 22 school year, up from 17%, which was pre-pandemic rates, highlighting the ongoing impact of systemic barriers and COVID-19 disruptions. While recent data shows a modest improvement, about 25.6% of students were chronically absent in the 2023 to 2024 school year. These rates are still alarmingly high in many high-need school districts. These persistent trends underscore the need for community-based multi-sector solutions like community health workers to model and address the root causes and reduce absenteeism statewide. Why does chronic absenteeism matter? Well, this issue is often linked, as previously mentioned, to lower academic achievement, increased likelihood of grade retention, and a higher risk of dropping out of school. However, chronic absenteeism is just more than a school attendance problem. It frequently signals deeper underlying issues that impact a student's ability to engage in learning. These may include unmet physical and mental health needs, poverty and food insecurity, housing instability, and unreliable transportation. Additionally, family stressors and lack of meaningful engagement between schools and families can further compound these challenges. Addressing chronic absenteeism requires a comprehensive, equity-driven approach that recognizes and responds to the root causes of affecting students' daily ability to attend and thrive in school.
The purpose of this project is to deploy a community health worker CHW program aimed at addressing chronic absenteeism in schools. As part of the implementation, CHWs will receive comprehensive training in cultural competence, HIPAA regulations, and strategies for building trust with families. Once trained, CHWs will be embedded directly within school environments to provide hands-on, personalized support to students and their families. To ensure a holistic approach, the program will establish partnerships between schools, healthcare organizations, and social service agencies, creating a robust referral system that connects families to the resources they need. The effectiveness of this program will be monitored by tracking school attendance trends over time, allowing stakeholders to evaluate its impact and make data-informed decisions for future improvements. Evaluate the effectiveness of the CHW program in addressing chronic absenteeism will focus on 3 key metrics. First, attendance rates will be monitored to assess whether the presence of CHWs lead to measurable improvements in student participation. Second, we will track referral success rates, which will help determine how effectively CHWs are connecting families to healthcare and social services through the established partnerships. Finally, we will measure the number of times CHWs provide direct support, offering insight into the level of engagement and responsiveness within the school community. Together, these metrics will provide a comprehensive view of the program's impact and guide future enhancements. The successful implementation of the CHW program will require 2 community health workers per school site. Resource planning includes funding for salaries, reimbursement for personal mileage, and ongoing professional development to ensure CHWs remain equipped to meet evolving needs. In addition, consent will be obtained from both students and guardians to ensure compliance with privacy and ethical standards. The program will also allocate additional resources to support services and maintain emergency funding to assist families facing urgent needs. The initiative will be rolled out in 2 phases. Phase 1 will run from August 2025 to August 2026, focusing on initial deployment and evaluation, while in Phase 2, from August 2026 to June 2027, we'll expand and refine the program based on the lessons learned.
The stakeholders we have identified for our chronic absenteeism project are presented on this power interest matrix, where we have classified them within the 4 categories of keep happy, manage closely, monitor, and keep informed. All of the stakeholders have a vested interest in the success of the project. However, as evidenced by this map, those who are directly affected or have a direct effect on the student's ability to attend school are in the categories of manage closely, for example, school staff, and keep informed, for example, parents and guardians or transportation providers. Our work breakdown structure highlights 4 key areas: planning, workforce development, community engagement and service delivery, and evaluation and sustainability. In the planning stage, this is where the program is developed. Baseline data is reviewed, areas of focus and communication pathways are identified, and the development of program materials begins. During workforce development, this is where the nuts and bolts of the program begin to develop. For the community health workers role, this is where identification of the role and scope of practice really begins. The training curriculum, certification programs, and onboarding programs are developed, and ultimately hiring will take place. So recruitment, the candidate pipeline, etc. In community engagement and service delivery, this is where the program or project is implemented. So relationships with community providers are developed and fostered. There is engagement in high need areas, partnerships are created, student support programs are created. Lastly, in evaluation and sustainability, key performance indicators and metrics are reviewed and evaluated. There is ongoing assessment of the program, and adjustments are made accordingly. We will go into further details regarding the specific activities in the following slides. Within the planning step, there were 4 key elements that were identified. The first being baseline data for chronic absenteeism. In this element, we wanted to identify data sources that collected the absenteeism rates. This would include baseline data from the district, and from all of these sources, we wanted to develop a questionnaire for parents on absenteeism and what their perceptions were for social support that was available to them. After doing this, our next step was community engagement and the evaluation plan. In doing this, we wanted to identify stakeholders and the audience, determine what would be the most responsive way to engage the students and their families, and develop a culturally responsive engagement plan that the community health workers could use in order to obtain the best response possible. When doing this, we wanted to also define the evaluation metrics and create worksheets for the encounters that the community health workers would have with the students and their families. The next step would be a communication plan between the identified stakeholders. Within this, we wanted to identify subject matter experts within each stakeholder group, assign a primary and backup contact for each group, determine what the preferred method of communication would be to ensure best routes or methods for communication, identify a communication pathway and an escalation pathway for issues to ensure that any concerns would be addressed in a timely fashion. Once all of these items were identified, create a draft communication plan that would be reviewed by all of the stakeholders and then ultimately approved and finalized, so that if any issues or concerns would arise, that all of those involved would know who to contact for what type of issue, and it would be escalated appropriately. In a similar fashion, once the program was developed, we would ensure that, again, it would be a culturally sensitive program so that there would be multilingual guides developed for the students and their families. So in order to do so, we would go back to the data that we obtained from the district and review demographics information to assess what languages would be needed, conduct interviews with the staff to assess areas of concern in relation to chronic absenteeism, again, review school records, and then once we had all of this information, develop a draft outline for the guides, distribute those guides for review to all the stakeholders, incorporate any comments to the guides, finalize the guides, ensure that the translations were appropriate and accurate, and then get those ready for usage.
To ensure clarity and consistency in the implementation of the CHW program, a detailed role description document will be developed outlining the responsibilities and scope of practice for each community health worker. This will be accompanied by a checklist of required credentials, skills, and experience to guide candidate selection. The reporting structure will be defined, which will include both direct supervision and any dotted line clinical oversight. For recruitment, sourcing channels will be established to attract qualified candidates supported by clearly defined screening data. A recruitment budget will be created to cover sourcing and advertising costs, and a candidate conversion rate will be tracked to identify and address any bottlenecks in the hiring process. Together, these efforts will ensure a strong foundation for building a capable and effective CHW workforce.
Under Part B, there is Activity 3, which is Culturally Tailored Training Curriculum. This activity involves determining training module topics, so like deciding what we're actually going to include in our trainings, establishing how the training will be delivered to the community health workers, and establishing the training facilitator qualifications, so what the facilitators actually need prior to being able to teach the community health workers, and defining assessment methods following the training. Activity 4 is certification and onboarding. This activity involves creating a checklist that outlines what community health workers need prior to the field work that they're going to be completing. So this could include background checks, orientations. It also involves developing a certification plan, which would include required training hours and assessment scores, scheduling onboarding sessions, and collecting feedback about onboarding. With that feedback, they can make adjustments to the onboarding process. Anything somebody gives feedback about that they didn't like, or things that were positive that they did like, they can make adjustments based on that. Lastly, activity 5 is ongoing training and professional development. This activity includes establishing continuing education and refresher training, defining competency-based modules informed by continuous learning and real-time field experience. So based on what they have learned while they're actually doing the work and using that to define and base training off of for continuing on in the programs. Tracking performance and ongoing professional development, and offering elective learning opportunities based on community health worker interest areas or emerging community needs. So if there are new issues emerging in the community, they can add that possibly to what they are learning about, and that way they can broaden their knowledge on that topic as well.
For this part of our project, we focused primarily on community engagement and service delivery. First, under C1, we have community outreach strategy, which targets neighborhoods with high rates of absenteeism and fewer local resources. We do plan to create a calendar for outreach events and build partnerships with community centers. In order to reach those diverse families, we'll develop multilingual materials to share during events and home visits by our community health workers. For C2 stakeholder involvement, we do plan to identify all key stakeholders, including school leaders, teachers, social workers, and parents. We'll hold input sessions to gather feedback from them and make sure everyone's voice is included. We'll also create engagement roles like an advisory board and community liaisons to keep the communication flowing all throughout the project. Under C3, we have student and family support services. We'll do a needs assessment to understand all of the barriers students and families face, like their mental health and housing and food insecurity. And with that, we'll build connections with our local services and create resource guides that our community health workers can hand out during their visits. For students with persistent absenteeism, we'll set up a case review process to provide them with that extra support. Finally, under C4, we have community-based program implementation, and this is about putting the plan into action. We'll pilot the program in areas of the greatest need and partner with student support services for smooth delivery. And we'll also collect evaluation metrics at baseline and 6 months and 1 year after the first contact to be able to track our progress and our impact.
To assess the impact of the CHW pilot, we're closely monitoring the attendance trends at 3 stages: baseline, during the program, and after 6 months of the initial interaction. We're also tracking how many times CHWs engage with students before a noticeable improvement, and creating evaluations for which support services provided to families were most effective in reducing barriers to attendance. To complement this data, we're also planning on conducting surveys with students and families at the same 3 points: before, during, and after the intervention, to capture changes in perception and outcomes, and also holding focus groups in high need areas to hear directly from participants about what worked, what didn't, and how the program can be improved. Looking ahead, we're identifying additional high-need schools for expansion. We'll conduct readiness assessments and engage school leaders, families, and community stakeholders to build support. And we're hoping that this model will be adjusted as needed to fit the context of each district, as we know that each district has different needs for the families and students. Finally, we're mapping out existing student support services and identifying gaps. By building new partnerships with the new community-based organizations, we can create a more comprehensive support network that improves student outcomes and assures long-term sustainability of the program.
Along with most projects, there are some risks involved. One risk would be potential language barriers. We would consider this to be a high risk. Um, Language barriers can be of concern um, for individuals who primarily do not speak English. There could be barriers to them receiving the full benefit of the program if there are not other options available to them. So, if there are not multilingual community health workers, if there are not pamphlets in other languages that can be provided to them. Another risk would be a lack of transportation. We would consider this high risk as well. Lack of transportation can be an issue if the cause of somebody's chronic absenteeism is due to not having proper transportation to school. It can be harder for a community health worker to address the situation without having the transportation support within the program. Another risk would be lack of reliable social support. This can be a high risk as well. Um, Emotional burnout can cause families and students to completely disengage from school. So if they are having some high stress situations in their household, family, even just outside of the household and just life in general, it can cause them to not prioritize uh, school, and it's not their main concern. And due to this, it could isolate them and make it even harder for community health workers to reach them. Lastly, lower income households or inconsistent work. We would consider that a medium risk. It's still pretty important. It's just not as important of a risk as the other three. It didn't stand out as high. Um, Childcare can become an issue in some families. Uh, as a lot of people know, childcare is highly expensive. So this can lead to older children staying home to take care of their younger siblings. If a child is not in an area where busing is available to school, a parent may not be able to afford a car or may not have the funding to get public transportation. And this can also lead to a child's inability to get them to school. So, trying to combat those risks can be difficult, but I think overall is worth the, the try in order to combat chronic absenteeism.
While our project plan is comprehensive, we did identify some resource limitations. One of our major challenges is funding, with just like many other projects, and it can be difficult to hire enough community health workers to be able to cover every high need school with our budget limits. Another limitation is having enough multilingual staff and translated materials to reach families who don't speak English as their first language. We will also need to build strong partnerships with the community centers, but some of these organizations might already be at full capacity and may not be able to take on our extra projects. Scheduling time with busy stakeholders like teachers and parents may also pose a challenge here. Lastly, even if the pilot is successful, we'll need sustainable funding to keep our support services running long term. Keeping these limits in mind will definitely help make sure the program could really work if we put it into practice.
In summary, although chronic absenteeism is a public health issue that affects families across the country, and a project addressing the causes of chronic absenteeism could certainly help to improve the well-being of our children, the sustainability of a project such as this could be very challenging due to a number of factors, primarily from a resource standpoint. Financially, it would require significant resources to sustain such a program. From a personnel standpoint, finding qualified personnel to fill the community health worker positions, as well as partnerships with various community providers for services, might prove to be challenging, as demonstrated by the risks we outlined.